This is Vatican City, the world's smallest sovereign state, just 49 acres in the heart of Rome. Every year, millions of people stand in St. Peter's Square and stare up at the Renaissance architecture. The soaring dome designed by Michelangelo, the marble columns that seem to reach toward heaven itself. They take photographs. They pray. They marvel at the concentration of art, history, and power packed into this tiny space. But what most of them don't realize is that the most fascinating parts of the Vatican are not visible from the square. They're not in the Sistine Chapel or the papal apartments or even the museums that draw endless crowds. They're behind locked doors, in temperature-controlled rooms, on shelves that stretch for miles, inside the Vatican Secret Archives. The official name, Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, translates to the Vatican Apostolic Secret Archive, though in 2019 the Vatican rebranded it as the Vatican Apostolic Archive, dropping the word secret in an apparent effort to seem more transparent. But the change in name did nothing to change the reality. Access remains tightly restricted. The vast majority of documents are still classified, and what lies on those shelves represents over 1,000 years of letters, decrees, trial records, and correspondence that have shaped not just the Catholic Church, but world history itself. The archive was officially founded in 1612 by Pope Paul V, though the Vatican had been accumulating documents for centuries before that. What made 1612 significant was the decision to centralize and organize the Church's records, creating a formal system for preservation and, more importantly, control, because these were not just historical artifacts. They were tools of power, proof of authority, evidence of decisions made by popes and cardinals that determined the fate of nations, the course of wars, and the boundaries of what could and could not be believed. The physical space is staggering. 53 miles of shelving. That's not an exaggeration. 85 kilometers of documents stacked floor to ceiling in climate-controlled vaults beneath Vatican City. Some estimates suggest there are over 35,000 volumes of catalogued materials, but that number is misleading, because many of those volumes are not single books. They are collections, bundles of letters, boxes of trial transcripts, registers containing thousands of individual entries. The true number of documents is incalculable, and much of it has never been fully catalogued. Access is not simply difficult. It is designed to be nearly impossible. You cannot walk in and request to see materials. You must be a qualified researcher with academic credentials. You must apply months in advance. You must specify exactly which documents you want to see, which requires already knowing what's in the archive, a paradox that keeps most researchers at the door. And even if you are granted access, you are only allowed to request 3 documents per day. 3. You cannot photograph them. You cannot remove them. You can only sit in the reading room under supervision and take notes by hand. Why such extreme restrictions? The Vatican's official explanation is preservation. These documents are fragile. Some are over 1,000 years old. Exposure to light, temperature changes, and excessive handling could damage them irreversibly. That explanation holds some truth, but it doesn't explain why digitization efforts, which could preserve and share the documents without physical risk, have been so slow and selective. or why certain sections remain completely closed, even to the most credentialed scholars. The truth is simpler: control. As long as the Vatican controls access, it controls the narrative. What's actually inside? The archive contains papal correspondence going back to the 8th century, bulls and decrees, letters between popes and kings, marriage annulments, excommunications, documents related to the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the Reformation, trial records of heretics, including Galileo, and the Knights Templar, financial records showing how the Church accumulated and managed wealth, and diplomatic correspondence that reveals the Vatican's role in European politics, wars, and colonization. But those are the documents we know about, the ones that have been studied at least partially by the handful of scholars granted access. What makes the archive truly fascinating and deeply unsettling is what hasn't been studied. The sections that remain closed. The documents referenced in catalogs but never released. The gaps in the timeline where records should exist but don't. And the persistent rumors among researchers that certain materials were deliberately removed, destroyed, or hidden even from the archive's own cataloging system. Take, for example, the records from the pontificate of Pope Pius XII, who led the Catholic Church during World War II. His actions, or lack thereof, regarding the Holocaust remain one of the most controversial topics in modern church history. For decades, researchers demanded access to his papers. The Vatican refused, citing the standard waiting period of 75 years after a pope's death before records are open. Pius XII died in 1958, meaning the records should have been accessible by 2033. But in 2020, Pope Francis surprised everyone by opening the archive early, allowing scholars to finally examine what Pius XII knew and when he knew it. What they found was complicated. Evidence that Pius XII was aware of Nazi atrocities far earlier than previously claimed. Proof that he chose diplomatic silence over public condemnation. But also evidence that the Vatican secretly helped save thousands of Jews. The documents painted neither a saint nor a villain, just a man making impossible choices in an impossible situation. But here's the problem. Even with that opening, researchers noted that sections of the archive were missing. Letters referenced in indexes that were not in the files. Gaps in correspondence during critical periods. And when asked about these gaps, Vatican archivists gave vague answers about documents being under review or relocated for preservation. What else is missing? And why? Those questions hang over every document that is released, because the Vatican Archive is not a neutral repository. It is an institution that has spent centuries managing its own image. And archives, no matter how old or extensive, can be edited. Documents can be removed. Catalogs can omit inconvenient truths. And researchers can be denied access without explanation. The reading room itself is an experience that reinforces this control. It's located in the Cortile del Belvedere, a courtyard within Vatican City. The room is beautiful, with vaulted ceilings and Renaissance-era frescoes. But it is also sterile, silent. Researchers sit at assigned desks. Vatican staff watch. Every document request is logged. Every page examined is recorded. There is no privacy, no chance to stumble upon something unexpected. You get exactly what you ask for, and nothing more. And then there are the documents you can't ask for, because they're not in the catalog, or they're listed but marked as restricted indefinitely, or they exist in sections that are simply closed. The Vatican has never released a complete inventory of what it holds. Researchers rely on partial catalogs, published indexes, and word of mouth, which means that proving a document exists is often impossible. You can't request something you don't know is there. One archivist, speaking off the record, described the system as deliberately opaque. He said that even Vatican employees don't have full access, that there are rooms within the archive that require special keys held by only a handful of people, that some documents are stored separately, in locations not even listed in the archive's official registry. He couldn't say what those documents were, but he confirmed they existed. The Vatican Archive is not just a library, it's a fortress, a place where history is guarded as carefully as any religious relic, because in many ways these documents are relics. They hold power, the power to prove or disprove claims, to validate or undermine authority, to reveal truths the Church has spent centuries managing. And as long as those documents remain locked away, the Vatican controls that power. Not history, not scholars, not the public, just the institution itself. So when we ask what's inside the Vatican Archive, we're really asking two questions. What do they allow us to see, and what are they still hiding? For nearly 400 years, the Catholic Church maintained an official list of forbidden books. It was called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Prohibited Books, and it represented one of the most systematic efforts at thought control in human history. First published in 1559 under Pope Paul IV, the Index was updated regularly, adding titles that the Church deemed dangerous to faith or morals. At its peak, the list contained over 4,000 works, books by scientists, philosophers, novelists, and theologians. Anyone caught reading, selling, or possessing these books risked excommunication, and every copy the Church could find was supposed to be destroyed. But here's what most people don't know. The Vatican didn't destroy all of them. It kept copies, locked them away in a restricted section of the archive, known simply as the Inferno. The name was borrowed from Dante, but the meaning was clear. This was a literary hell, a collection of books deemed so dangerous that even their existence was barely acknowledged. And today, centuries after the Index was officially abolished in 1966, those books remain locked away, accessible only to a tiny number of researchers who can provide extraordinary justification for why they need to see them. The Inferno is not a metaphor. It is a physical space within the Vatican Archive, a series of locked rooms where banned books and manuscripts are stored. The collection includes first editions of works that were condemned, manuscript copies of texts that were never published because of church censorship, and even handwritten letters between authors and church officials pleading for their work not to be banned. These are not just historical curiosities. They represent the Church's centuries-long battle to control what people were allowed to think, read, and believe. What kinds of books ended up on the Index? The list reveals as much about the Church's fears as it does about the authors. Scientific works that challenged biblical cosmology. Galileo Galilei's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, which argued that the earth orbited the sun, was banned in 1633 and remained on the index until 1835. Nicolaus Copernicus's De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, the foundational text of heliocentric theory, was banned for nearly 200 years. Johannes Kepler's works on planetary motion, banned. The message was clear. Any science that contradicted literal biblical interpretation was heresy. But it wasn't just science. Philosophy was equally suspect. René Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, found his works banned for questioning theological assumptions. Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which examined the limits of human knowledge and reason, was condemned. John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, which argued that knowledge comes from experience rather than divine revelation, made the list. The Church feared any philosophy that suggested human reason could operate independently of religious authority. Literature was not spared either. Novels that depicted clergy in unflattering ways, that questioned church teachings, or that simply portrayed human sexuality honestly, were banned. Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, condemned for adultery and moral corruption. Victor Hugo's Les Miserables for its sympathetic portrayal of social revolution. Émile Zola's entire body of work, banned for its naturalistic depiction of human suffering and institutional failure. Even Dante's De Monarchia, a political treatise arguing for the separation of church and state, was banned by the very institution that named its forbiddance collection after his Inferno. And then there were the religious texts that didn't conform to Catholic orthodoxy. Protestant theological works. Anything by Martin Luther was automatically banned. The Talmud was condemned. Translations of the Bible into vernacular languages without church approval were forbidden, because the Church insisted that only Latin was suitable for Scripture, and that only priests should interpret it. The act of translating the Bible so ordinary people could read it was, for centuries, considered heretical. What's most disturbing is how the index functioned as a tool of control. It wasn't enough to ban a book. The Church actively hunted for copies. Inquisitors searched homes, libraries, and bookshops. When forbidden books were found, they were burned in public ceremonies, often along with the people who owned them. The penalty for possessing banned books could be excommunication, imprisonment, or death. And for authors, being placed on the index was professional and sometimes literal annihilation. Their work was suppressed. Their ideas were criminalized, and they lived under constant threat of arrest. But the Church kept copies. Why? The official explanation is that theologians needed access to heretical texts in order to refute them, that you couldn't argue against dangerous ideas without knowing what those ideas were. But that explanation only justifies keeping a few copies for scholarly purposes. The Vatican kept extensive collections, multiple editions, manuscripts with authors' annotations, correspondence that showed how these books were written, published, and distributed. The collection suggests something more than mere refutation. It suggests obsession, a need to possess and control the very ideas it condemned. Today, the index no longer exists as an official document. In 1966, Pope Paul VI abolished it, acknowledging that the Church could no longer credibly maintain a list of forbidden books in the modern world. But the books themselves remain locked away. The Inferno still exists, and access is more restricted than almost any other section of the archive. Researchers must demonstrate not just academic credentials, but a specific theological or historical reason for viewing the materials. And even then, only certain texts are made available. Others remain completely off-limits, even to Vatican scholars. Why continue restricting access decades after the index was abolished? If these books are no longer considered dangerous, why not release them? The Vatican's answer is always the same: preservation, sensitivity, respect for the historical context in which they were banned. But those explanations ring hollow when you consider that the Church actively digitizes and shares other historical materials. The decision to keep these books restricted is not about protecting the books themselves. It's about protecting the Church from the questions these books raise, because the index is evidence of censorship, of intellectual oppression, of a Church that feared ideas more than it valued truth. Every book in the Inferno represents a moment when the Church chose control over curiosity, when it decided that protecting doctrine was more important than allowing believers to think for themselves. And releasing those books, making them freely available to researchers and the public, would force the Church to confront that history in a way it has never fully done. There are also hints that the Inferno contains more than just published banned books, manuscripts that were never printed because the Church suppressed them before publication, early drafts of works that were revised under Church pressure with the original uncensored versions locked away, and letters from authors begging the Church not to destroy their life's work. One researcher who gained limited access to the collection described finding a handwritten plea from an 18th century philosopher whose book had been condemned. The letter, addressed to a cardinal, argued that his work was not heretical, but simply an honest attempt to reconcile faith and reason. The cardinal's response attached to the file was brief: "Reason without faith is rebellion." The book was burned. The philosopher died in obscurity. But the Vatican kept the letter. What else is in there? We don't fully know, because the catalogue of the Inferno is itself restricted. Researchers cannot browse the collection. They cannot request to see what's available. They can only ask for specific texts they already know exist, which requires having access to information about the collection that the Vatican does not readily share. It is a system designed to ensure that only those who already know what to look for will ever find it. And even then, access is not guaranteed. The Inferno is a graveyard of ideas. But unlike a real graveyard where the dead are meant to rest in peace, this one is a prison. The books are not resting. They are captive, held by an institution that once tried to destroy them and now refuses to release them. And as long as they remain locked away, the Church controls not just the books themselves, but the history of its own censorship. The Vatican Archive holds over 15,000 letters written by and to popes, spanning more than a millennium. These are not just religious correspondence. They are diplomatic negotiations, political maneuvering, declarations of war, and decisions that reshaped entire continents. Because for most of European history, the Pope was not just a spiritual leader. He was a political power broker. Kings sought his approval. Emperors feared his condemnation. And a single papal letter could legitimize a throne or topple a dynasty. The archive contains the evidence of that power. and some of those letters reveal moments when the Church made choices that would echo for centuries. One of the most famous, or infamous, is the letter regarding King Henry VIII of England. In 1527, Henry petitioned Pope Clement VII for an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. His reasoning was both personal and political. Catherine had not produced a male heir, and Henry was desperate for a son to secure the Tudor succession. He also wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. The request put Clement in an impossible position. Catherine was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who had significant military and political power over Rome. Denying Henry risked losing England. Granting the annulment risked war with Charles. Clement delayed. He stalled. He appointed commissions to study the matter. But he never gave Henry what he wanted. The correspondence between Henry's representatives and the Vatican, preserved in the archive, shows the escalating frustration on both sides. Henry argued that his marriage to Catherine was invalid because she had been briefly married to his deceased brother Arthur. The Bible forbade such unions, Henry claimed, citing Leviticus. The Pope countered that a previous papal dispensation had made the marriage legitimate. Back and forth the letters went. Legal arguments, theological interpretations, threats barely concealed in diplomatic language. And then Henry stopped asking. In 1534, he declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, severing ties with Rome entirely. The English Reformation was not primarily about theology. It was about a king who wanted a divorce and a pope who wouldn't give it to him. The letters in the archive document that failure. They show a church that valued political stability over pastoral flexibility, and they mark the moment when the Vatican's grip on European Christianity began to fracture. But Henry VIII was not the first king to challenge papal authority through correspondence. The archive contains letters from the investiture controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries, when popes and emperors fought over who had the right to appoint bishops. The conflict came to a head in 1076 when Pope Gregory VII excommunicated Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, for refusing to submit to papal authority. Henry responded by declaring the Pope deposed. Gregory's letter, preserved in the archive, is a masterpiece of medieval power politics. It does not just excommunicate Henry, it releases all of his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. It invites rebellion. It transforms a religious condemnation into a political weapon. Henry eventually submitted. In one of the most dramatic moments in medieval history, he traveled to Canossa in northern Italy and stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days, begging the Pope for forgiveness. Gregory lifted the excommunication, but the damage was done. The message was clear. The Pope could unmake kings, and the letters documenting that exchange, the initial condemnation, Henry's pleas, and Gregory's reinstatement, sit in the archive as proof of papal power at its zenith. Then there are the letters that reveal the Church's role in colonization. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued a series of papal bulls that divided the newly discovered Americas between Spain and Portugal. The Treaty of Tordesillas, which formalized this division, was based on those bulls. The letters related to this decision, preserved in the archive, show the Vatican acting not as a spiritual authority, but as an imperial arbiter. The Pope was drawing lines on maps, granting entire continents to Catholic monarchs. and justifying the subjugation of indigenous populations under the guise of spreading Christianity. One letter in particular stands out. Written by a Spanish missionary in the 1500s and sent to the Vatican, it describes the treatment of indigenous people in the Americas: slavery, forced conversions, mass deaths from disease and brutality. The missionary pleaded with the Pope to intervene, to use his authority to stop the abuses. The response, if there was one, is not in the public record. But the abuses continued for centuries, and the Vatican's role in legitimizing colonization through those original bulls remains one of the darkest chapters. In Church History. The archive also contains correspondence related to Galileo Galilei's trial. In 1633, Galileo was summoned to Rome to face charges of heresy for supporting the heliocentric model of the solar system. The trial documents, including letters between Galileo, church officials, and the Inquisition, are preserved. They show a man desperate to avoid condemnation, offering to retract his views, pleading that his work was hypothetical rather than factual. But the Church was unmoved. Galileo was found guilty, forced to recant, and placed under house arrest for the remainder of his life. What's chilling about the letters is the tone. There is no doubt, no acknowledgment that Galileo might be right, just certainty that his ideas contradicted Scripture and therefore must be false. One letter from Cardinal Robert Bellarmine to Galileo, written years before the trial, lays out the Church's position with stark clarity. Bellarmine writes that as long as heliocentrism is presented as theory, it is acceptable. But the moment it is claimed as truth, it becomes heresy. The distinction is revealing. The Church could tolerate science as speculation, but it could not tolerate science that challenged its interpretation of reality. It took the Vatican over 300 years to formally admit that Galileo was right. In 1992, Pope John Paul II acknowledged the error. But the letters remain, and they serve as a reminder that the Church's relationship with truth has not always been straightforward. Not all the letters in the archive are about conflict. Some reveal moments of unexpected diplomacy. During World War II, the Vatican acted as an intermediary between warring nations. Letters between Pope Pius XII and various governments show attempts to negotiate prisoner exchanges, facilitate communication between enemies, and provide humanitarian aid. Whether those efforts were sufficient, given the scale of the Holocaust, remains fiercely debated. But the letters show a Vatican trying to navigate a war it could not stop. And then there are the letters that were never sent. Drafts, revisions, correspondence that was written but reconsidered. These are some of the most revealing documents in the archive because they show what the Church thought before deciding how to present itself publicly. One such draft from the 19th century shows a pope preparing to condemn the abolition of slavery. The final version, which was sent, softened the language significantly, but the draft reveals that the initial instinct was to defend the institution of slavery as compatible with Christian teaching. It was only political pressure that forced a revision. What makes these letters so powerful is their permanence. A speech can be forgotten. A policy can be reversed. But a letter, once written and preserved, becomes evidence. It cannot be erased or reinterpreted without the physical document contradicting the claim. And the Vatican has been very careful about which letters it allows researchers to see. Some collections remain closed. Others are accessible only with special permission, and researchers who have worked in the archive report that even when letters are available, they are often incomplete. Missing pages, sections redacted, references to other letters that cannot be located. Why would letters be removed or hidden? The most likely answer is that they contain admissions the Church does not want public, acknowledgments of mistakes, evidence of decisions made for political rather than spiritual reasons, proof that popes, for all their claims of divine guidance, were often simply men trying to hold on to power in a world that was constantly challenging them. The papal letters in the Vatican Archive are not just historical documents. They are a record of power, how it was claimed, how it was exercised, and how it was sometimes lost. And as long as some of those letters remain hidden, the full story of the Church's influence on world history cannot be told. The word Inquisition conjures images of torture chambers, pyres, and religious fanaticism. And while those images are not entirely inaccurate, they don't capture the full reality of what the Inquisition actually was. It was not a single event, but a series of institutions spanning over 6 centuries, from the 12th to the 19th, designed to identify, interrogate, and punish heresy. And it was meticulously documented. Every accusation, every interrogation, every verdict. The records were carefully preserved, copied, and stored. And much of that documentation now sits in the Vatican Archive, offering a window into one of the darkest periods of Church history. The archive contains trial records from multiple inquisitions. The medieval Inquisition, which targeted Cathars and other heretical sects in the 13th century. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 to root out converted Jews and Muslims, suspected of practicing their old faiths in secret. The Roman Inquisition, founded in 1542 to combat Protestantism. Each left behind mountains of paperwork, denunciations, confessions, many extracted under torture, sentences, and records of executions. These are not abstract historical documents. They are the bureaucratic machinery of religious persecution. One of the most famous sets of trial documents in the archive concerns the Knights Templar. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the Templar order, orchestrated their arrest on charges of heresy. The accusations were lurid: worshipping false idols, denying Christ, engaging in obscene rituals. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, a convenient excuse to seize the Templars' vast wealth. But the Inquisition provided the judicial framework to legitimize the persecution. Under torture, many Templars confessed to the charges. The trial records document the interrogations in chilling detail. Questions asked, answers given, methods of torture employed. The rack, strappado, sleep deprivation, starvation. Men were broken until they said whatever their interrogators wanted to hear, and then those confessions were used as evidence of guilt. In 1312, Pope Clement V officially dissolved the Knights Templar. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314. The order's wealth was distributed to other military orders and to the crown. The Templar trial documents sat in the Vatican Archive for 700 years before being fully opened to scholars. In 2007, the Vatican published a limited edition facsimile of the proceedings, known as the Chinon Parchment, which revealed that Pope Clement V had actually absolved the Templars of heresy in 1308, but that absolution was kept secret. But persecution continued, and the Templars were destroyed anyway. Why? Because political necessity outweighed truth. The documents prove that the Vatican knew the charges were false, but allowed the order to be annihilated regardless. Then there are the records of Galileo's trial, which we touched on earlier but deserve deeper examination. The full transcript, preserved in the archive, shows the proceedings in detail. Galileo was not arrested immediately. He was summoned to Rome, treated with a degree of respect, allowed to stay in comfortable accommodations rather than a prison cell. But the trial itself was a foregone conclusion. The Inquisition had already decided he was guilty. The proceedings were simply theater. What the documents reveal is the Church's reasoning. Galileo had been warned in 1616 not to teach heliocentrism as fact. A letter from Cardinal Bellarmine, included in the trial records, makes this clear. Galileo could present the sun-centered model as a mathematical hypothesis, but he could not claim it was literally true. When Galileo published his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems in 1632, he violated that order. The book clearly argued for heliocentrism, and worse, from the Church's perspective. It made the geocentric position look foolish by putting those arguments in the mouth of a character named Simplicio, which means simpleton in Italian. The Inquisition saw this as both disobedience and mockery. Galileo was found vehemently suspect of heresy. He was forced to kneel and recant, reading a prepared statement disavowing his own research. The exact wording is preserved in the archive. I abjure, curse, and detest the aforesaid errors and heresies. He was then sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his life. The trial documents are a study in institutional insecurity. The Church could not tolerate being proven wrong, so it punished the man who proved it. But not all Inquisition trials involved famous figures. The vast majority of records concern ordinary people accused of minor heresies. A woman who claimed to have visions, a man who doubted transubstantiation, a family suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. The Spanish Inquisition was particularly brutal in this regard. Between 1480 and 1834, it tried approximately 150,000 people. Estimates suggest that around 3,000 were executed, though many more died in prison or from torture. The trial records follow a pattern. Someone denounces the accused, often anonymously. The accused is arrested and held in secret. Interrogation begins. If they confess, they are sentenced. If they refuse, torture is applied. The Inquisition had strict rules about torture. It could not cause permanent injury or death. It could only be applied once, though that rule was often circumvented by declaring subsequent sessions as continuations rather than new applications. And a confession obtained under torture had to be confirmed later when the accused was no longer under duress. In practice, this meant the prisoner was told that if they did not reaffirm their confession, they would be tortured again. The archive contains detailed instructions on how to conduct these interrogations, manuals written for inquisitors, guidelines on what questions to ask, how to interpret answers, and when to escalate to physical coercion. One such manual, the Directorium Inquisitorum, written in 1376 by Nicolaus Imrich, is preserved in multiple copies. It reads like a bureaucrat's handbook for persecution, clinical, methodical, and utterly devoid of mercy. What makes the Inquisition records particularly disturbing is their ordinariness. These were not rogue fanatics acting in secret. This was official church policy, documented and approved at the highest levels. Popes authorized these trials. Cardinals oversaw them. And the vast machinery of the Church, its legal scholars, its scribes, its enforcers, all participated in creating a system where holding the wrong belief could cost you your life. The archive also contains records of trials that reveal the Inquisition's obsession with sexual morality. Priests accused of soliciting sex during confession. Women accused of witchcraft, often because they practiced herbal medicine or lived independently. Men accused of sodomy. The Inquisition saw sin everywhere, and it appointed itself the judge. The trial records document punishments ranging from public penance to imprisonment to execution, and they reveal a church deeply uncomfortable with human sexuality, trying to regulate the most intimate aspects of people's lives. Not all trials ended in conviction. The archive contains acquittals, cases where the evidence was deemed insufficient, or the accused successfully defended themselves. But even acquittal came at a cost. The accused often spent months or years in prison awaiting trial. Their reputations were destroyed, and the accusation alone was enough to ruin lives. The process was the punishment. In recent decades, the Vatican has opened more Inquisition records to researchers. The decision has been framed as transparency, an acknowledgement that the Church's past includes dark chapters that should not be hidden, but access remains controlled. Researchers must still apply for permission. Certain sections remain closed, and the Vatican has been careful to emphasize that the Inquisition, while brutal by modern standards, was not as deadly as popular myth suggests. The Church points to scholarly estimates showing that execution rates were lower than previously believed, but those arguments miss the point. The issue is not the body count. It is the principle that the Church believed it had the right to punish people for their thoughts, that it created legal systems to enforce orthodoxy through fear, and that it documented every step of that process with the same bureaucratic precision it applied to everything else. The trial records in the Vatican archive are not just history. They are evidence of institutional violence carried out in the name of God, and they raise an uncomfortable question. What other records of church abuses are still locked away? The Inquisition ended officially in the 19th century, but the impulse to control belief did not. The archive contains 20th century documents that have not been released. Files on priests accused of abuse, records of financial scandals, correspondence related to the Church's actions during World War II. If the Vatican was willing to open the Inquisition records, what is it still protecting? And why? Every archive has gaps, documents lost to fire, flood, or simple neglect. But the Vatican archive's gaps are different. They are too consistent, too convenient, and in some cases too well documented to be accidental. Researchers who work in the archive describe a strange phenomenon. They find references to documents that should exist, but don't. Catalog entries that lead nowhere. Indexes that mention files later marked as missing or relocated, with no explanation of where they went. And entire periods of history where the record is suspiciously thin. One of the most glaring gaps concerns the Avignon papacy. The period from 1309 to 1377, when the papal court moved from Rome to Avignon, France. For nearly 70 years, the popes ruled from French territory, under the influence and often the control of the French crown. This was one of the most controversial periods in church history, a time when the papacy's independence was openly questioned and its moral authority severely damaged. You would expect the Vatican Archive to contain extensive documentation from this period, correspondence, financial records, diplomatic negotiations, but much of it is missing. What remains suggests why. The Avignon popes were deeply corrupt. They sold church offices to the highest bidder, a practice called simony. They lived in luxury while much of Europe suffered from war and plague, and they were politically compromised, acting more as servants of the French crown than as independent spiritual leaders. When the papacy finally returned to Rome in 1377, there was a strong incentive to erase or bury evidence of just how corrupt the Avignon years had been. Records that made the popes look weak, venal, or subservient would have been inconvenient. And many of those records are simply not in the archive today. Researchers have found references to entire volumes of Avignon correspondence that are listed in medieval catalogs, but cannot be located. One 15th century archivist noted that certain shameful documents from the Avignon period had been removed for the dignity of the Holy See. Removed to where? The note does not say. Were they destroyed? Hidden in another location? Transferred to a private collection? No one knows. But the absence is significant. Another suspicious gap surrounds the Borgias, one of the most notorious families in papal history. Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI in 1492 and spent his 11-year reign embroiled in scandal. Accusations of bribery, nepotism, incest, and murder followed him constantly. His son, Cesare Borgia, was a ruthless political operative who likely inspired Machiavelli's The Prince. His daughter, Lucretia, was rumored to have poisoned enemies at dinner parties. The Borgias were everything the papacy was not supposed to be. And yet, the Vatican Archive contains remarkably little documentation of Alexander. VI's pontificate. There are official bulls and decrees, the kind of public documents that had to be preserved for legal and administrative reasons. But personal correspondence is sparse. Financial records are incomplete, and documents that might reveal the inner workings of the Borgia papacy, the deals made, the bribes paid, the crimes committed, are largely absent. One historian who spent years researching the period described it as a black hole. She found references in other archives, letters from foreign diplomats and Italian nobles describing the Borgias' actions. But when she tried to verify those accounts using Vatican sources, she hit walls. The documents were not there. Did the Borgias themselves destroy incriminating evidence? Possibly. But it's more likely that later popes, eager to rehabilitate the Church's reputation, ordered the removal of materials that portrayed the papacy in such a degraded light. The gap is not accidental. It is curated. Then there are the gaps related to the Reformation. The 16th century was an existential crisis for the Catholic Church. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, nailed to a church door in 1517, ignited a movement that fractured Christianity and ended the Church's monopoly on Western religious life. You would expect the Vatican Archive to contain extensive records of the Church's response, internal debates, strategy sessions, correspondence with those trying to stop the Reformation. And some of that exists, but not as much as there should be. Researchers have noted that records from the early years of the Reformation, roughly 1517 to 1530, are surprisingly thin. This was the period when the Church could have responded more effectively, when compromise might still have been possible. But the archive contains little evidence of serious internal discussion about how to address Luther's criticisms. What it does contain is condemnation, bulls excommunicating Luther, orders to burn his books, but not the kind of thoughtful theological engagement that might have prevented the split. Why? One theory is that the documents existed but were removed because they showed the Church leadership as indecisive, divided, and slow to respond, that they revealed a Vatican more concerned with maintaining authority than addressing legitimate grievances. Admitting that would undermine the Church's narrative that the Reformation was purely the result of heresy rather than institutional failure. So the documents that might complicate that narrative are gone. The gaps are not limited to medieval and Renaissance periods. The 20th century has its own mysteries. Researchers have long sought full access to records from Pius XII's pontificate during World War II, particularly concerning the Holocaust. As mentioned earlier, the archive was opened in 2020, but even then scholars noted missing documents, letters referenced in indexes that were not in the files, entire weeks in 1942 and 1943, critical years of the Holocaust, where correspondence is inexplicably sparse. One researcher found a catalog entry for a letter from a German bishop describing deportations of Jews from his diocese. The letter was dated October 1942, but when he requested the file, he was told it could not be located. It was marked as under restoration, a designation that remained unchanged for the 3 years he had access to the archive. Other researchers reported similar experiences. Documents listed but unavailable. Files that were temporarily relocated, with no indication of when they would return. Why would World War II documents be missing or restricted, even now, 80 years later? The most likely explanation is that they contain information the Vatican finds embarrassing. Evidence of collaboration with fascist regimes, proof that Church officials knew about the Holocaust earlier and in more detail than they admitted, or correspondence showing that financial and political considerations influenced decisions about whether to speak out. Whatever the reason, the gaps exist, and they prevent a full accounting of the Church's actions during one of the darkest periods in human history. There are also structural gaps built into the archive system itself. Vatican policy requires that records remain closed for 75 years after a pope's death. This rule, established in the 20th century, means that anything related to recent popes is automatically restricted. The stated reason is to protect living individuals who might be mentioned in the documents and to allow for sensitive matters to be handled discreetly. But it also means that the Church controls the narrative about its recent history for decades after events occur. Pope John Paul II died in 2005 under the 75-year rule. His full records will not be opened until 2080. Pope Benedict XVI died in 2022. His records will not be accessible until 2097. By the time researchers can examine those documents, everyone involved will be long dead. Context will be lost. Witnesses will be unavailable. And the Church will have had 3/4 of a century to shape how those pontificates are remembered. The gaps in the Vatican archive are not random. They follow patterns. Documents that make the Church look corrupt, politically compromised, or morally failed are disproportionately absent. Records from periods of crisis are incomplete. And files that might answer uncomfortable questions are missing, restricted, or mysteriously unavailable. Some of this may be due to genuine loss over centuries, but much of it appears deliberate. Archives are supposed to preserve history, but they can also erase it. And the Vatican, with its centuries of experience managing information, knows that sometimes the most effective form of control is not what you reveal, but what you hide. Because a gap in the record is not proof of wrongdoing. It's just an absence. And absences are much harder to prove than lies. In 1981, the Vatican opened a new section of the archive. Not in the historic buildings where centuries-old documents had always been stored, but in a modern facility built underground, climate-controlled, earthquake-resistant, and equipped with security systems that would be more at home in a military installation than a library. This was the Bunker Archive, though the Vatican never officially called it that. It was designed to house the most sensitive materials from the 20th century, documents that were too recent, too controversial, or too politically explosive to be stored with the historical collection. The bunker was built during the Cold War, and that context is important. The Vatican was navigating a world divided between capitalist West and communist East. It had diplomatic relations with dozens of countries, many of them hostile to each other. And it had intelligence gathered through its global network of bishops, priests, and nunchos that governments would have paid dearly to access. The bunker was not just about preservation. It was about security. What's inside? The Vatican has never released a comprehensive inventory. But we know from researchers who have gained limited access that the bunker contains files on major 20th century events where the Church played a role. World War I, the Spanish Civil War, World War II, the Cold War decolonization, and the various political upheavals that shaped the modern world. Each of those events generated correspondence, intelligence reports, and internal Church assessments that are now stored in the bunker. One of the most sensitive collections concerns the Vatican's relationship with fascist regimes. During the 1920s and 1930s, the Church signed concordats, formal agreements, with Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, Franco's Spain, and Salazar's Portugal. These agreements guaranteed the Church certain rights and protections in exchange for political support, or at least neutrality. The documents related to these concordats are in the bunker, and while some have been released to researchers, many remain classified. The Lateran Treaty of 1929, which established Vatican City as an independent state, is well documented. But what about the negotiations that led to it? The compromises Pius XI made with Mussolini? The internal church debates about whether to align with a fascist dictator. Those documents exist, but access is restricted. Researchers who have seen portions of the file describe letters where Vatican officials weighed the moral costs of the agreement against the political benefits. They knew Mussolini was brutal. They knew his regime was oppressive, but they prioritized the Church's institutional survival. The Concordat with Nazi Germany in 1933 is even more controversial. Signed just months after Hitler took power, it gave the Church legal protections in Germany while legitimizing the Nazi regime in the eyes of many Catholics. The Vatican has long argued that the Concordat was a defensive measure, an attempt to protect German Catholics from persecution. But documents in the bunker suggest the calculation was more complex. Some Vatican officials saw Hitler as a bulwark against communism. Others believed the Church could influence the regime from within. All of them underestimated the evil they were dealing with. Researchers who have accessed portions of the Concordat. Files describe correspondence between Vatican officials and German bishops that reveals deep internal division. Some bishops warned that Hitler could not be trusted. Others argued that the Concordat was the Church's best option, and a few expressed open sympathy for Nazi anti-communism, even if they had reservations about other aspects of the regime. These are not documents the Vatican once widely discussed, because they show that the Church's relationship with Nazism was not simply a matter of survival. It was in some cases cooperation. Then there are the files related to the Ratlins, the networks that helped Nazi war criminals escape Europe after World War II. The Vatican has always denied institutional involvement. It acknowledges that individual priests may have helped fugitives motivated by Christian mercy or anti-communist sentiment. But it insists the Church as an organization was not complicit. The problem is that documents in the bunker suggest otherwise. One researcher, granted access to a small portion of the files, found evidence that Vatican officials provided false identity papers to individuals they knew were wanted for war crimes. The justification, according to internal memos, was that these men would be useful in the fight against communism. Their past crimes were secondary to their potential future utility. The researcher was allowed to take notes, but not photographs. And when he requested access to related files, he was told they were under review and unavailable. The bunker also contains files on the Vatican's Cold War intelligence operations. The Church was not a neutral observer during the Cold War. It actively worked to undermine communist regimes, particularly in Eastern Europe. Priests and bishops in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and other Soviet bloc countries acted as informants, passing information to the Vatican, which then shared it with Western intelligence agencies. Some of this is now public knowledge. Pope John Paul II's role in supporting Poland's solidarity movement is well documented. But the full extent of Vatican intelligence activities remains classified. One former CIA officer, speaking years after his retirement, described the Vatican as one of the agency's most valuable sources during the Cold War. He said the Church had access to information that even Western spy agencies struggled to obtain, and it was willing to share as long as the cooperation remained secret. The documents proving that cooperation are in the bunker, and they will likely remain there for decades. Then there are the financial files. The Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for the Works of Religion, has been embroiled in scandal repeatedly. Money laundering, ties to organized crime, suspicious transactions involving shell companies and offshore accounts. The most famous scandal involved Roberto Calvi, the Italian banker found hanged under Blackfriars Bridge in London in 1982. Calvi had close ties to the Vatican Bank, and his death ruled as suicide, but widely believed to be murder, raised questions about what he knew and who wanted him silenced. The Vatican Bank documents from that period are in the bunker. Researchers have requested access for years. The Vatican has refused, citing privacy laws and the confidentiality of financial records. But the refusal raises obvious questions. If the bank's dealings were legitimate, why not release the documents and clear the institution's name? The continued secrecy suggests there are transactions the Church does not want scrutinized. The bunker also contains files on clerical sexual abuse, though how many and covering what period is unclear. In 2001, the Vatican issued a directive requiring bishops worldwide to report credible abuse allegations to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in Rome. Those reports, along with the Vatican's responses, are stored in the bunker. This is one of the most tightly controlled sections. Not even researchers with top-level clearance can access it. The Vatican's explanation is that the files contain sensitive information about victims and accused priests, and that releasing them would violate privacy and potentially interfere with ongoing legal cases, but that explanation only goes so far. Many of the cases are decades old. The accused are dead. Legal proceedings are complete, and yet the files remain sealed. Victims' advocates argue that the real reason is institutional protection, that the files would show patterns of cover-up, reassignment of abusive priests, and prioritization of the Church's reputation over the safety of children. The Vatican denies this, but it also refuses to release the documents that could settle the question. One bishop, speaking off the record, described seeing a small portion of the abuse files. He said they were organized by diocese and dated back to the 1950s. Each file contained correspondence between local bishops and the Vatican. He described reading letters where bishops asked Rome for guidance on how to handle priests accused of abuse. The Vatican's advice in many cases was to transfer the priest quietly and avoid scandal. The bishop was shaken by what he read, but he was also bound by secrecy. He could not discuss the files publicly without risking his position. The bunker is not just a storage facility. It is a fortress within a fortress. Access is more restricted than any other part of the archive. Materials stored there are not included in the general catalog. Researchers cannot request them unless they already know with specificity that a document exists and can justify why they need to see it. And even then, approval is rare. The bunker represents the Vatican's determination to control its most recent and most damaging secrets, but technology is making that control harder to maintain. Leaks are more common. Whistleblowers are more protected, and the expectation of transparency is greater than ever. The Vatican can lock the bunker, but it cannot lock the minds of the people who have seen what's inside. And sooner or later, those people talk. In 2012, the Vatican announced an ambitious project. It would digitize its archive, making millions of documents accessible online to researchers worldwide. The announcement was celebrated as a historic step toward transparency. Finally, scholars wouldn't need to travel to Rome, wait months for approval, or be limited to 3 documents per day. They could access materials from their own institutions. The Vatican framed it as entering the digital age, embracing openness and scholarship. More than a decade later, the progress has been disappointing. Only a small fraction of the archive has been digitized. The Vatican claims the delay is due to the sheer scale of the project, the fragility of many documents, and the cost of high-quality scanning, all of which is true. But researchers who work closely with the archive have noticed something else. The documents being digitized are not random. They follow a pattern. Materials that are already well studied, relatively non-controversial, and unlikely to generate scandal are prioritized. Everything else waits. One of the most glaring omissions is the complete collection of Inquisition trial records. The Vatican has digitized samples, enough to show it's making progress. But the bulk of the trials, particularly those from the Spanish Inquisition and the Roman Inquisition's activities during the Counter-Reformation, remain analog only. Researchers must still travel to Rome, request specific files, and work under supervision. Why? If the Vatican is committed to transparency about this dark chapter in its history, why not make the records fully accessible? The likely answer is that full digitization would enable systematic analysis that has never been possible before. Right now, a researcher can spend years examining a handful of trials, but if all the records were online, scholars could use text analysis, statistical methods, and cross-referencing to identify patterns. How many trials ended in execution? How often was torture used? What were the most common charges? And most importantly, how did the Inquisition evolve over time? Did it become more or less brutal? More or less arbitrary? Those questions could be answered definitively with full access, and the answers might be more damaging than individual cases. Another category conspicuously absent from digitization is financial records. The Vatican Archive contains centuries of documentation about how the Church accumulated and spent money, tithes, indulgences, sale of church offices, land holdings, banking operations. Some of this has been studied, but large sections remain unexamined because they're simply too voluminous to analyze without digital tools. If those records were online, economic historians could trace the flow of wealth through the Church and answer uncomfortable questions. How much money did the Church extract from the poor through indulgences? How much wealth was accumulated through the Crusades? What were the Vatican's financial dealings with colonial powers? The Vatican has digitized papal bulls and major decrees, the kind of official documents that are already well known. But correspondence, the personal letters between popes and other figures, remains largely in physical form only. Why? Because correspondence reveals thinking that was never meant to be public. Official decrees are carefully worded. Letters are not. They contain admissions, doubts, and unfiltered opinions. Digitizing them would make them searchable, allowing researchers to quickly find every reference to a particular topic, person, or event. That kind of access could reveal patterns of thought and decision-making the Vatican would prefer remain obscure. There's also the matter of metadata. When documents are digitized, they're tagged with information: date, author, subject, keywords. This metadata makes searching possible, but it also makes the documents analyzable in new ways. You can see, for instance, every document created during a particular pope's reign, or every mention of a specific heresy, or every letter to a particular king. That level of analysis could reveal things the Vatican hasn't wanted to acknowledge. Gaps in the record become more obvious. Patterns of cover-up emerge, and documents that have been hidden in plain sight, buried in massive collections, suddenly become discoverable. One researcher described requesting digitization of a specific collection related to the Vatican's World War II activities. She had spent years working through the physical files and wanted to do textual analysis on the correspondence. The Vatican declined her request, citing privacy concerns and sensitivity of the material. But the people mentioned in those documents are long dead. The events are 80 years in the past. What privacy is being protected? The only reasonable answer is institutional privacy, the Vatican's own. Then there's the technical question of what digitization actually means. The Vatican has created digital images of some documents, high-resolution scans that capture the physical appearance of the page. But images are not the same as searchable text. To make a document truly digitized, you need optical character recognition, OCR, which converts the image into machine-readable text. That's where real accessibility happens. But OCR for medieval and Renaissance handwriting is difficult. It requires expensive software and trained personnel, and the Vatican has been slow to invest in it. Why? Because searchable text is far more powerful than images. A researcher looking at an image still has to read through the document manually, but searchable text can be queried instantly. Every mention of a keyword appears immediately. Cross-references become automatic, and patterns that would take years to find by hand emerge in seconds. The Vatican's reluctance to invest in full OCR suggests it prefers documents to remain difficult to analyze. There are exceptions. The Vatican digitized and released the trial documents of the Knights Templar in 2007, as mentioned earlier, but that release was carefully managed. It was published as a limited edition, expensive facsimile. Only a few hundred copies were produced, and while the documents are now technically public, their accessibility remains limited to those who can afford the publication or access. One of the few institutions that purchased it. This is transparency in name only. The Vatican has also partnered with outside organizations on digitization projects. But these partnerships come with restrictions. The digital images are often owned jointly, meaning the Vatican retains veto power over how they're used. Researchers must agree not to share the files widely or use them in ways the Vatican deems inappropriate. One scholar described signing an agreement that prohibited her from using the digitized documents in any publication that damages the reputation of the Holy See. What constitutes damage was left undefined, giving the Vatican broad discretion to object. Another issue is the Vatican's refusal to digitize materials that are still technically restricted. Remember the 75-year rule for papal records. Documents from recent pontificates are closed regardless of format, but there's no technical reason they couldn't be digitized now and released later when the restriction period ends. Doing so would ensure the documents are preserved and ready for access when the time comes. But the Vatican hasn't done this, which raises the question, does it plan to release them at all? Or will the restriction period keep getting extended? There's also the matter of documents that were digitized, but then removed from access. One researcher described finding references in online catalogs to documents that had been scanned and were briefly available. But when she tried to access them months later, they were gone. The catalog entries remained, but the links were broken. When she inquired, she was told the files had been temporarily removed for review. That was 5 years ago. They have not reappeared. What's being reviewed? And by whom? The Vatican has never explained its process for determining which digitized documents remain public and which are pulled. But the pattern suggests that documents generating unwanted attention are removed. If a researcher publishes findings based on a newly digitized source, and those findings are embarrassing, the source becomes unavailable to others who might want to verify or build on the work. It's a form of retroactive censorship. The promise of digitization was openness. The reality has been selective disclosure. The Vatican digitizes what it wants scrutinized and keeps everything else in physical form behind access restrictions that haven't changed in decades. And by controlling the pace and scope of digitization, it maintains control over which questions can be answered and which remain out of reach. Not all secrets in the Vatican archive remain hidden. Some have been found, documented, published, and then quietly suppressed, not through overt censorship, but through more subtle means. Academic careers derailed, funding withdrawn, access revoked. The Vatican has learned that you don't need to burn books or imprison scholars when you can simply make their work disappear into obscurity. And researchers who have uncovered uncomfortable truths about the archive's contents have learned that speaking too loudly comes with consequences. One of the most significant discoveries came in the 1960s when a Jesuit historian named Father Burkhard Schneider was granted unprecedented access to Pope Pius XII's wartime correspondence. Schneider was part of a team authorized to examine the records and produce a published collection called Actus et Documents du Saint-Siège relatifs à la Seconde Guerre mondiale. The project was meant to defend Pius XII against accusations of silence during the Holocaust. But what Schneider found complicated that narrative documents showed that Pius XII knew far more, far earlier than the Vatican had ever admitted. Reports from bishops describing mass deportations of Jews, intelligence from Vatican diplomats confirming extermination camps, pleas from Catholic resistance figures begging the Pope to speak out, and Pius's responses, careful, diplomatic, and ultimately silent. Schneider and his colleagues published 11 volumes between 1965 and 1981, but they were selective. They chose documents that showed the Pope's impossible position, his fear that speaking out would make things worse, his efforts to help through quiet diplomacy. What they didn't publish were the documents showing that Vatican officials debated whether the Holocaust was even happening, with some expressing skepticism about Jewish accounts, or letters where financial considerations, the Church's property, holdings in Germany, influenced decisions about how forcefully to condemn the Nazi regime, or correspondence suggesting that some Vatican officials saw communism as a greater threat than Nazism and were willing to tolerate Hitler as a bulwark against Stalin. Those documents existed. Researchers who gained access to the full files in 2020 confirmed it. But they were excluded from the official publication. Schneider himself never spoke publicly about what he had left out. He died in 2002, but colleagues who worked with him described his frustration. He wanted to publish a more complete picture, but Vatican officials insisted on editorial control. They framed it as necessary to protect living individuals and avoid misinterpretation. But the result was a sanitized version of history that served the Church's interests rather than the truth. Another researcher, an Italian historian named Carlo Ginzburg, uncovered documents in the 1970s that revealed the Inquisition's obsession with controlling popular religious practices. His book, The Cheese and the Worms, examined the trial of a 16th-century miller named Minocchio, who was executed for heresy. Minocchio's crime was not that he denied God, but that he had his own interpretation of creation, one he described using the metaphor of cheese forming in milk. The Inquisition could not tolerate freelance theology, even from an illiterate peasant. Ginzburg's work was groundbreaking because it showed that the Inquisition wasn't just targeting organized heretical movements. It was policing individual thought. But after the book's success, Ginzburg found that his access to Vatican materials became increasingly difficult. Requests that had previously been approved were denied. Documents he referenced were suddenly unavailable for conservation reasons. He was never officially banned from the archive, but the obstacles multiplied until continuing his research became impractical. Then there's the case of Father Gabriel Amorth, the Vatican's chief exorcist, who we discussed earlier in relation to the possession files. In the years before his death, Amorth gave interviews where he hinted at things he had seen in restricted sections of the archive. He mentioned documents describing exorcisms performed on popes, suggesting that even the Church's highest leaders were not immune to what the Vatican believed was demonic influence. He referenced files on possession cases that had been deliberately suppressed because they contradicted Church doctrine or suggested phenomena the Church could not explain. Amorth never provided specifics. He was bound by confidentiality agreements. But after his death, researchers who tried to follow up on his claims were blocked. The Vatican denied that such documents existed. When pressed, officials said that if Amorth had seen them, they were personal notes, not part of the official archive. But that explanation doesn't hold up. Amorth specifically said the documents were in the archive, not his private collection. Either he was lying, which seems unlikely given his position and reputation, or the Vatican is denying the existence of materials it doesn't want examined. More recently, a French historian named Olivier Potier gained access to financial records from the 15th century. He was researching the Church's funding of Renaissance art and architecture. What he found were detailed accounts of how that money was raised. Indulgences, payments for forgiveness of sins, were a massive revenue source. But the records showed something the Church has always downplayed, that the sale of indulgences was explicitly framed as a transaction. Pay this amount, receive this reduction in purgatory. It was spiritual commodification, and the documentation was extensive and unapologetic. Potier published his findings in a French academic journal. The article was largely ignored outside specialist circles, but when he applied to return to the archive for further research, His request was denied. No explanation. He appealed. Denied again. He reached out to colleagues who confirmed they had experienced similar treatment after publishing work that made the church uncomfortable. The pattern was clear. Publish once, lose access. One American scholar, who requested anonymity, described finding correspondence from the 1950s between Vatican officials and American bishops about how to handle priests accused of sexual abuse. The letters used language that was shockingly frank. They discussed managing victims' families, moving priests to avoid scandal, and prioritizing the church's reputation. The scholar made copies of several letters, following archive protocol. When she tried to return to continue her research, she was informed that her visiting scholar status had been revoked due to irregularities in her previous work. She was never told what those irregularities were, and her attempts to publish. The letters she had already copied were met with legal threats from Vatican attorneys. The archive also employs more subtle forms of control. Documents are often provided in ways that make systematic analysis difficult. Instead of complete files, researchers receive excerpts. Instead of original letters, they get transcriptions, prepared by Vatican staff, which may omit irrelevant details. And when researchers point out that documents they've requested appear to be incomplete or edited, they're told that's simply how the materials were preserved. One tactic is selective access within documents. A researcher might be allowed to see a letter, but not the attached memoranda that provide context. Or they might see a trial transcript, but not the pre-trial depositions. This creates a fragmented picture that serves the Vatican's interests. Researchers can write about what they've seen, but they can't claim to have seen everything, because they haven't. And that incompleteness protects the Church from definitive conclusions. There are also researchers who never publish what they find, who see something that disturbs them so deeply they choose silence. One priest, a scholar with decades of experience, in the archive was asked in a private conversation what the most shocking thing he'd ever seen was. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "There are things in there that would destroy faith, not because they disprove God, but because they show how often the Church acted as if it didn't believe in God either." He refused to elaborate, and he never published anything about it. The Vatican's relationship with researchers is transactional. Access is a privilege, not a right, and that privilege can be revoked at any time, for any reason, or no reason at all. This creates a chilling effect. Scholars self-censor, knowing that being too critical could end their careers. They frame their findings diplomatically. They avoid conclusions that would anger the Church, and they leave out details that, while true, would be too damaging to publish if they ever want to return. What's been found and silenced? We don't know the full extent, but we know enough to understand that the archive contains far more uncomfortable truths than have been made public. And we know that the Vatican has been effective at ensuring those truths remain obscure, not through dramatic acts of suppression, but through the quiet, bureaucratic exercise of power over access, reputation, and the scholarly process itself. We've explored what's in the Vatican archive: the banned books, the papal letters, the Inquisition trials, the missing years, the bunker's 20th century secrets, the documents they won't digitize, and the research that's been suppressed. But there's one final question that hangs over everything. What still cannot be accessed at all? Not with credentials, not with patience, not with any amount of justification. What parts of the archive remain completely closed, even to those who have spent decades earning the Vatican's trust? The answer is more extensive than most people realize, because while the Vatican has opened significant portions of the archive over the past century, there are entire sections that remain off-limits, not temporarily restricted pending the 75-year rule, not under review or being restored, just closed. And when researchers ask why, they receive vague answers about sensitivity, security, or the personal nature of the materials. But those explanations don't hold up when you consider what has already been released. One of the most significant closed sections is known simply as the Riserva. The reserve. It's not a physical location, but a classification. Documents marked Riserva cannot be requested. They don't appear in catalogs accessible to researchers. And according to archivists who have spoken off the record, even Vatican employees need special authorization to handle them. What's in the Riserva? No one outside a very small circle knows for certain. But the existence of such a classification proves that the Vatican maintains a tier of secrecy beyond even the restricted sections we've discussed. 1. Theory is that the Riserva contains documents related to living individuals, correspondence involving current or recent church officials, files on ongoing investigations, materials that could compromise diplomatic relationships or endanger people if released. That explanation makes sense for some materials, but the classification has existed for centuries, long before privacy laws or modern security concerns, which suggests it's always been a place to hide things the Church doesn't want examined. Then there are the documents that don't officially exist. Researchers occasionally find references in published letters or historical accounts to materials that should be in the archive, but aren't listed in any catalog. Sometimes these are described in enough detail that their absence is glaring. One historian found a 17th century bishop's memoir that mentioned sending a detailed report to Rome about indigenous religious practices in South America, including descriptions of what the bishop believed were demonic rituals. The report should be in the archive, but there's no record of it. Either it was destroyed, which would be unusual given the Vatican's obsession with documentation, or it was filed in a way that makes it invisible to researchers. Another category of inaccessible materials involves the Church's financial dealings. We've mentioned the Vatican bank scandals, but there are older financial records that remain completely closed. The Church's involvement in the slave trade, for instance, is documented in non-Vatican sources. We know that Church institutions owned slaves in the Americas, and that popes issued bulls that provided theological justification for the practice. The Vatican archive should contain extensive financial records of these transactions, profits, expenses, correspondence about the trade. But researchers who have requested access to financial records from the colonial period are routinely denied. The explanation is always the same: privacy and sensitivity. But whose privacy? The enslaved people are long dead. The institutions that profited are still operating. The only privacy being protected is the Church's own. There are also files related to the Vatican's intelligence operations that remain completely sealed. During World War II and the Cold War, the Church ran what amounted to a global spy network. Information gathered by clergy around the world was funneled to Rome and, in many cases, shared with Western governments. Some of this is now acknowledged, but the full extent of those operations, who reported what and to whom, remains classified. One researcher who specializes in Cold War history requested files on the Vatican's activities in Poland during the 1980s. She was told those materials are not available to non-Vatican researchers under any circumstances. Why? The people involved are mostly dead. The Soviet Union no longer exists. What national security interest could possibly justify continued secrecy? The most likely answer is that the files would reveal how deeply the Vatican was embedded in Cold War politics, that it wasn't simply supporting religious freedom, but actively working to destabilize governments it opposed, and that some of its clergy were functionally intelligence operatives. That kind of revelation would complicate the Church's image as a purely spiritual institution. Then there are the documents no one is supposed to know exist, materials that have been removed from the main archive and stored elsewhere. One Vatican archivist, speaking years after retirement, described a sealed room within the archive that required keys held by only 3 people. He said he was taken there once, early in his career, to retrieve a specific document for a cardinal. The room was small, lined with locked metal cabinets. He was told to wait outside while his superior retrieved the file. When asked what was in the cabinets, his superior said, "Things that should have been destroyed, but weren't." The archivist never entered that room again. What things? The most disturbing possibility is documents that contradict core church teachings. Not in a theological sense, but historically. Proof that certain saints never existed. Evidence that relics are fraudulent. Correspondence showing that church leaders knowingly perpetuated myths they knew were false, because those myths served institutional purposes. If such documents exist and were released, they wouldn't destroy faith in God, but they might destroy faith in the institution that claims to represent God. There's also the matter of prophecies and mystical texts. The Vatican has always had an uneasy relationship with private revelations, visions, apparitions, prophecies from saints and mystics. Some are approved and become part of official teaching, like Fatima. Others are condemned as false or demonic. But there's a third category. Prophecies that are neither approved nor condemned, just filed away and never discussed. These are often the most specific, the ones that name names or describe events in ways that can be verified or disproved. The Vatican doesn't want to approve them because doing so would bind the Church to specific predictions, but it doesn't want to condemn them either, in case they turn out to be true. So they're locked away, accessible to no one. One researcher claimed to have seen a catalog entry for a collection of letters from a 16th century mystic describing visions of future popes. The description in the catalog said the letters contained specific prophecies deemed too precise for public disclosure. When he requested access, he was told the collection had been moved to a restricted location and was no longer available for research. He appealed, denied. He tried to find references to the mystic in other sources. Nothing. It was as if the person had been erased from history. except for that one catalog entry, which was later removed from the database. The archive also refuses to release materials related to certain controversial figures within the Church. There are popes whose reigns were so scandalous that the Vatican prefers they remain obscure. Not just the Borgias, but others. Pope Stephen VI, who exhumed his predecessor's corpse, put it on trial, and threw it in the river. Pope John XII, accused of turning the Vatican into a brothel. Pope Benedict IX, who allegedly sold the papacy. These are documented in external sources. But the Vatican's own records about these popes, their correspondence, their decisions, remain restricted. Officially, it's because the materials are too fragile or haven't been properly cataloged. But centuries have passed. How long does cataloging take? Finally, there are the materials the Vatican claims don't exist at all. When researchers ask about specific documents they've found referenced in non-Vatican sources, they're sometimes told there's no record of such materials ever being in the archive. This happens too often to be simple gaps in cataloging. It suggests deliberate denial, and it raises the question, how many documents have been removed from the archive entirely? Destroyed? Moved to private collections? Hidden in locations even most Vatican officials don't know about? One former archivist, speaking shortly before his death, said there are documents that only the Pope can access, not the prefect of the archive, not the cardinals, just the Pope. He said this tradition goes back centuries. Materials passed from one pope to the next with the instruction that they are never to be shared. He didn't know what those documents contained, but he said every new pope is shown them shortly after his election, and every pope upon seeing them understands why they must remain secret. What could be so sensitive that even church leaders cannot know? Perhaps proof of institutional decisions so morally compromised that acknowledging them would be impossible. Perhaps evidence that foundational church claims are historically questionable. Or perhaps something simpler and more human, documentation of the Church's worst moments, preserved not as history, but as warning. A reminder to each new pope of what the institution is capable of when power is valued over principle. The Vatican Archive is not a complete record. It is a curated collection, shaped by centuries of decisions about what to preserve, what to suppress, and what to erase. What we've explored in these chapters represents what can be known, pieced together from limited access, leaked information, and the work of researchers who've spent careers navigating the restrictions. But the full truth of what's in the archive and what's been kept out of it may never be known, because the Vatican has mastered the art of historical control, not through censorship alone, but through access, silence, and the patient work of keeping secrets buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, tradition, and time.